Hello, everyone, and welcome to the webcast. My name is Christine Dorsey Davis. I am the Executive Director of the Ohio chapter of the American Planning Association, and I am your webcast moderator. Today is Friday, September 17th, and we will hear the presentation, The 15-Minute City, Our Past and Our Future. For technical help during today's webcast, you can type your questions in the chat box found in your GoToWebinar tool panel. And for your content questions related to the presentation, again, just type those in that chat questions box in your tool panel, and we will answer the questions during the Q&A. Coming up next on your screen is a list of our sponsoring APA chapters and divisions for 2021. Thanks to all those participating sponsors for making these webcasts possible and free to members. Today, we are sponsored by the Urban Design and Preservation Division. So thanks to you for sponsoring today's webcast. We're looking forward to it. Coming up next on your screen is a list of our upcoming sessions. You can register for these and all of our upcoming webcasts at ohioplanning.org/planningwebcast. We are actually booked through the end of the year, and we are now starting to book alternate days besides Fridays just to fit all of these great sessions in. And as that information comes into me, I can get registration going. So again, be sure to visit our webcast webpage for more information and to register. Today's session has been approved for 1.5 CM credits for live viewing. You can log your credits by heading over to planning.org, log into your My APA account, and from there you can either search by today's title or event number, both of which can be found on our webcast webpage. And if you are on social media, make sure that you like us on Facebook. That's where I post any immediate important information like date or time changes for our sessions. I'll also post up when we have a new session available for you to register for. So be sure and like us so that you get all those good details. And we record all of our sessions and we post them up on our YouTube channel. So be sure to subscribe to us so that you can get notified when a new session is available for you to view. Just head over to youtube.com/planningwebcast and we will pop up along with our well over 350 recordings. So to get this recording and others, again, just head over to our YouTube channel. As a reminder, once again, if you have questions for our panelists, just type those in that questions box. Please don't use the raise hand function. Just type your questions right in and we will get to those at the end of the presentation during the Q&A. So with that, I am going to turn it over to Jim Barnes, who is going to introduce today's speaker. Jim.
Thank you, Christine. I'm Jim Barnes. I'm with the Urban Design and Preservation Division of APA. And the Urban Design and Preservation Division, as Christine mentioned, is sponsoring this webcast today. And we're a nationwide community of professionals dedicated to supporting educational and networking opportunities for planners, allied professionals, designers, preservationists, etc. And within this division of APA, we offer a lot of opportunities to promote these topics that are important and current in the field of planning right now. And although our membership is, relatively spread across the country, many of the planners confront the same problems. So it's helpful that we have a forum to communicate that. And on our site, we try and publish articles, case studies, etc., that highlight the diversity of approaches used, and we hope that these studies and other case studies and articles that might be published are a resource for you and the members, trying to show common issues and commonality among the different membership and in our particular field, and sparks a lot of discussion among the practitioners we have. So we encourage you to join us and also visit us at urbandesign.planning.org. Joining us today is Dr. Norman Garrick, who is the Emeritus Professor in the Department of Civil Engineering at the University of Connecticut. He is still also the co-director of the Sustainable Cities Research Group at the University of Connecticut. And in these roles, he's had some groundbreaking research and led some research on street networks, their impact on traffic safety, including bike and pedestrian safety, car travel, the health of citizens, also including the evolution of parking provision in cities and the impact on that urban fabric in the city and the role of that as well in reducing inducing traffic in cities. the factors contributing to that widening gap in our country and other developed countries in terms of traffic fatality, the potential impacts of autonomous vehicles, the design and operation of streets, design according to shared space concepts. He believes that in this era of megacities, urban decay, and suburban sprawl, and along with global climate crisis we're experiencing now and the energy insecurity that comes along with that, the issue of how we create more sustainable places is fundamental in the challenges that we're facing as planning and transportation professionals. And in his research, he continues to look at the understanding of sustainable places in order to better equip us with the wherewithal to plan and build better, more attractive, more efficient, and more livable, and actually, as he puts it, yes, more lovable places. Today, Dr. Garrick will be talking to us about, as Christine mentioned, the 15-minute city. He believes that the idea of the 15-minute city is a concept that's here to stay because it's an elegant summation of what has always been a fundamental goal of transportation and land use systems for creating environmentally and socially sustainable places. It also contains the seeds for the revitalization that's needed and the restoration that's needed in thousands of older cities and towns across our country. But what does the actual 15-minute city look like? Dr. Garrick today, to illustrate this concept, will use a case of Zurich, Switzerland, which has slowly over the last 50 years recreated itself as one of the world's most preeminent 15-minute cities. So without further delay, I'd like to introduce and leave you to Dr. Norman Garrick, who will be spending some time with us today. Dr. Garrick?
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. Now I need to figure out how to share my screen. So,
You have a pop-up message.
yes,
that
and it
says
says
that you've been made the presenter.
yes. Okay. I didn't think this would be a problem. So I am not seeing that screen, I guess.
You're not seeing the pop-up message?
The security and privacy screen.
Hold on one second.
Yeah. Okay, I've been on 3 webinars this week, and every single one we have had technical difficulties. So I think it's something we have all come to be familiar with.
I'm just going to pull it up here on my end.
Okay.
Just so that we can keep moving here. It's thinking.
Oh, I see. Change presenter. I see that now. So I'm going to do that. But it doesn't list me as one of the presenters, potential presenters. So can we try that again?
Hold on.
It might work easier for me to make the presentation.
Hold on one second.
Okay.
All right, let's give it a whirl one more time.
All right. It's yes. I think we're making progress. Oh, I see. I see what I need to do. And this is GoToMeeting. I need to give it permission. Okay. I'm still not listed, unfortunately. I'm not sure. This is GoToWebinar. Oh, I'm sorry. This is the wrong GoToWebinar. All right, let's try.
Jim is pulling it up. Oh,
Yes.
Jim is pulling it up so that he
Yes.
can do the slides for you. Sorry,
Okay
everybody.
then.
This is the one time we didn't check ahead of time, and this is what happened. Jim,
Oh,
let us know when you have that up.
Let me go ahead and pull that up. I have that now. And
I just gave you controls.
thank you.
Thank you.
No problem. Are you seeing my screen?
not yet.
We sure are.
All right.
If you could just put it into presentation mode, like hit the from beginning button, and we'll be good to go. Thanks, Jim.
Except that
I'm on
I'm not seeing. Ah.
let's see. I have a double screen, so I need to pick the right screen. Bear with me.
Oh, good. Excellent.
Should be good to go now. And I
Yay,
Yes.
we did it.
Okay.
Thanks, everybody, for your patience.
Welcome, everyone. It's really a pleasure to be here and honored to address you. First I'd like to thank Jim for his gracious introduction, but I would like to add something to that introduction. So, about 10 years ago, yes, 10 years ago exactly, I went on a sabbatical leave to Zurich, Switzerland, at the ETH, the Swiss Federal Institute of Technology. And while there, I'd known Zurich for a long time, from 1986. But while in Zurich, spending some time living there, myself and my husband decided that we wanted to actually become permanent residents of Zurich. So 3 years ago, I went back to Zurich for another sabbatical leave, and we actually applied and became Swiss residents. And we have been living part-time since then in Zurich, Switzerland. And the reason why I think this is relevant to the story I'm going to tell is because I've always enjoyed living in Zurich. I understood some of the transportation issues relating to living in Zurich, but I didn't really understand how other things came together to make the city that I saw there on the ground, to make that city work. So when I was invited to make this presentation last year, you guys planned so far ahead, I decided to make it about Zurich because I think there are so many lessons that we can learn looking at how Zurich works as a low car city, but also other aspects relating to affordable housing, etc. So, with that background, let me start not in Zurich, but in Paris. So while I was in Zurich, living in Zurich in 2017, they had, I think it was the third edition of their car free day. And what that meant was it was a day when, or a part of a day when, no cars or very few cars were allowed into the city. And I'd been reading about this, and I was really fascinated by this idea and wanted to go and see what um, Paris looked like under those conditions. So, Jim, the next slide, please. Yes, so this is a view looking down the Champs-Élysées, and you can see it was a magical event. People just came from everywhere and took over the city, and it was a very, very, very different place to be. It was magical. It was very special, and so it really left a mark with me. But what's interesting about Paris and me, so go to the next slide, Jim. Paris for me, I've never really liked Paris, and I know that is really odd to say, And people look at me and give me strange looks when I say that. But I've never really liked Paris. The first time I went to Paris was in 1986, 1985, December of 1985. And it just didn't appeal to me. And I knew that I was supposed to like Paris, but I didn't understand what it is about Paris that I didn't like. And at the time, I was just getting my PhD in pavement technology. So I didn't have the language, I didn't have the sense of cities to really explain what it was about Paris that I disliked. But I think over time I've begun to realize that, as you can see in this picture, is that so much of Paris over the years has been given over to cars. And it makes for a very, very tough place, at least for me, to be in. The noise, the pollution, the difficulty in getting around by foot or even by their transit system. I mean, when we go there as American, transit seem okay. But if you're going there from a different kind of European city, such as Amsterdam or Zurich, it's really frustrating. So over time, I began to understand what I didn't like about Paris, and I could articulate it. But Paris is changing. Next slide, please. And under the leadership of their current mayor over the last 10 years, this is Anne Hidalgo, who over the last 10 years has transformed really very visionary leadership. And she has transformed Paris in so many ways. And at first, it looked like it was really just modest changes. But as she has gone on and her policies have become more popular, the changes have become more and more and more impressive. So, for example, they just announced that in the entire city, there is going to be a 30 kilometers per hour speed limit. That is 18 miles per hour, except around the Arc de Triomphe. I don't understand what that is about. But the transformation has been really astounding. And I think the other day I saw a picture of videos from Paris, and I just couldn't believe it. It reminds me more of Amsterdam, of people on bikes everywhere. Next slide, please. And I may not necessarily agree with this headline, Liberation of Paris from Cars is working. It's working, yes, but it's still a work in progress. So there are lots. I think Paris is like the gift that keeps giving for us as planners, because it shows what can be done under inspired leadership. And it shows some of the steps, and it shows how popular these changes can be when done properly. Next slide. But one of the things that came out of Paris is this idea of the 15-minute city. And what's interesting about this is that it's not a new idea, but it's captured the imagination of planners, of engineers, of lay people, of politicians all over the world. So it's a really powerful idea, not because it's new, not because nobody else has done it, but because it is really so powerful an idea that has captured people's imagination. And yesterday, while I was preparing for this presentation, I went online to see what was being said about it. And there's an awful lot of nonsense being written online, but it's nonetheless a very powerful idea. Next slide. So with that said, we are taking this idea from Paris. So how should we interpret it? What does it look like? And in my mind, it looks a lot, it feels and looks a lot like the life I've been living in Zurich, Switzerland. So I thought maybe we should deconstruct exactly what Zurich is about and to see what lessons we can take from Zurich that might be applied to cities, towns, and villages all over the place, not just North America, but all over the world. But often in my presentation, I am guided by this idea of amnesia that Jane Jacobs talk about in A Dark Age Ahead. What she says is that while people possess a community, they usually understand that they can't afford to lose it. But after it is lost, gradually, even the memory of what was lost is lost. And in a lot of ways, I think that is what we deal with every day in transportation and land use planning. When people think about what our cities are like now, it's hard for them to understand how much their cities have changed and how different it was before these changes, and even what these changes, what the city was like before. I think it's really important to reflect on those changes because in a lot of ways we have thrown out the baby with the bath water in terms of transportation planning in the last 7 years. 70 years actually, and we need to be able to understand what was there before and to understand how we can get some of the good things. It's not to create the past, to recreate the past, but is to understand where we have come from, that journey, and will help us to use both the good and the bad from the past as we move into the future. And this is what has guided a lot of my research over the years. So the next slide, please. Um, an example of this idea of understanding the past is in this book written by Glenna Lang, where she talks about Scranton, Pennsylvania, which is like many of the cities you all work in. Is a city now where we would not look to for urban planning lessons, unfortunately. But she looks at what Scranton was like in the 1915s, 20s, and 30s when it was at its height of its power, and when Jane Jacobs grew up in that town and and was able to understand the functioning of the city. In essence, Scranton, that is described in that book, is the model of the 15-minute city. Next slide, please. So I just want to go back just a little bit further. Some of you might recognize this. This is a 1909 Model T. And this is really, in a lot of ways, the start of the automobility, of mass automobility in America with the mass production of cars. Next slide. And the end point of this, click again, Jim. The end point of this is this image that some of you might recognize is from 3 or 4 Thanksgiving ago. It was while I was living in Switzerland, and Swiss people were astounded to see this image, to see really this visual representation of just how far we have gone down that auto-dependent rabbit hole. Next slide. You need to keep clicking, Jim. So one of the things that I've done is to document, keep going, going all the way to 2020. One of the things I've done is document the changes in how we travel in America over the last 100 years or so. Okay, that's far enough. Actually, if you could go back 2 or 3 clicks. Yes. And I think this is a really fascinating image of really, it's the history of America. You can see, for example, the Great Depression, which was a mere blip in our drive to become auto-dependent, to become mobile with cars. World War II was somewhat of a bigger blip. And then the 2 blips in the 70s, the first Gulf War and the second Gulf War. And then in 2004, something culturally happened, and I don't think anybody has been fully able to explain what happened, when for the first time without a major event like a war, driving decreased in America over a 10-year period. It didn't return to its peak until 10 years later. But then after that, it just started on its merry way again. And then, of course, you recognize that last year was a very, very different year. It fell by about 15%, nowhere near the fall in World War II. And you can see it's coming back somewhat. So this graph of traveling maps onto our history, our policies for transportation, etc. Jim, give me some more. The three flags. Thank you. And one of the things that is interesting is that we are so different from the rest of the world. There is no country quite like us, maybe except for some small oil producing countries. But in terms of the amount of driving we do on a per capita basis, even a car dependent country like Canada is 2/3 of where we are. A car producing country and somewhat car dependent country, Germany is a half, less than a half, and Japan is about a third, another car producing country, but one that actually is not as car dependent as we are. So we need to reflect on this history. We need to understand where it is, how we came about to be in this situation, and where and why we need to be changing. Keep going, Jim, for the rest of this slide. So you can see some of the issues mapped onto there. So to put this in perspective, yes, keep going, the next one. To keep this in perspective, each year Americans made the equivalent of 16,000 trips to the sun and back. That's a lot of driving. Next slide, please. And this one you have to click through also. And the thing that we really need to remember every time when we look at these dry numbers is that we're talking about real consequences of these, of being so car dependent. Consequences that does not help us as a country now or in the future. One of the papers I wrote for Transportation Research Board this year looks at people that are forced to drive in this country, and that is about maybe a quarter of the people in this country. But it also looks at people that want to use transit, that go out of their way to use transit, another quarter of the population. But in most places, except for New York State and a few other cities, they don't have that option. So that's one of the consequences. We have developed a system where people keep saying, we like it, but the evidence does not support that. But then when we start thinking about things like fatalities, we have 3 times more fatalities than other developed countries, traffic fatality. The health impact, our research showing obesity, heart disease relating to the amount of driving versus the amount of walking, the climate change issues. So it's not just dry numbers, they have real impact. So next slide, please. And sorry, let's go back to that one. It should be a video. Okay, yeah, there it goes. So this is an amazing picture, but look at that bend in the road there. And there's something really interesting happening. This is the city of Los Angeles. And what our eye is drawn to is this amazing effort that is put into getting around by cars. But it's not very clear to you. I mean, I wish I was in control, but if you look at the bend, you see something else that is going on in this picture. This is LA, and LA is actually trying to become transit friendly. So you see this little tiny train passing through there, and it's hidden in this sea of automobility. And to me, in some ways, it's an encouraging sign, but it also is a reflection of just how far we have to go. But the thing is, places like LO realize that we have to make the change because of all of the problems that we talked about in the last slide. And they are trying to make this change. Next slide, please. So back again to the historical work that we have done. This is some mapping we have done using Sanborn map, recreating Bridgeport, Connecticut of 1913. You can see what you study in planning school. It looks like a very intact, very vibrant, mixed use. The blue is the downtown area, lots of commerce and mixed use buildings. The green, single family house, which is the way we have built cities traditionally in America. But this is like the description of Scranton. This is 1913 Bridgeport. Next slide. 1954, you see some changes. You're seeing more parking. The red is parking. You're seeing some deterioration in the downtown. This is 1913 to 1954. But in essence, even in 1954, Bridgeport was still Bridgeport. Next slide, please. This is Bridgeport 2013. Absolutely a place that you cannot imagine that actually had the structure that we saw just 60 years ago. The two freeways going north, south, and east, west. I-91 going east, west, and Route 8, I believe, going north. The city, all the red is parking, replacing the mid-size buildings in the downtown with these high-rise buildings. And interestingly, just to tell you how we have made these cities vulnerable and unresilient, the tallest building in this picture is the former People's Bank, which was just bought out by an out-of-state bank. And they have announced that they are going to move most of their staff out of Bridgeport. I'm not sure what remains of Bridgeport when People's Bank move out. But this city is so dependent on this one use. And let me illustrate that further. Next slide. And clicking through, yes. So we have Bridgeport. Yes, let's pause there. Bridgeport 1913 was what I would say is the 15-minute cities. Lots of things to do downtown, schools, parks, etc. Lots of people living there to take advantage. The train track that connected to New York City, to Hartford, and to New Haven. So this is Bridgeport 1913. This is what was done to Bridgeport. So go to the next two clicks. What we have created is the opposite of the 15-minute city. And this you will recognize is not something that is unique to Bridgeport, Connecticut. This is a city with 60% of its surface area covered by either roads, highways, or parking. Most people here, or most people that work here, are coming from someplace, and there is almost nothing to do in the downtown that adds to the pleasure of daily life. And we have documented some of that. Two more clicks. Next one. You can see the change going from the commerce. I believe that was about 4 million to about 3 million now. Industrial, about 3 million to almost nothing. And the next one, residential, from about 2 million to again almost nothing. So we have created a monoculture in our cities, and Bridgeport is a prime example of this. But not only did we create a monoculture, but look at the difference in active use in downtown Bridgeport in 1913 compared to now. Where did that land go? It's gone to accommodate cars, either cars driving or cars parked. This is, and Bridgeport 4 years ago went through a bankruptcy. And you look at these numbers and you think, that's not a surprise. And next slide, please. And the flip side of what we did to Bridgeport is what happened in the suburbs surrounding Bridgeport. We created the exact opposite type of monoculture. So work one place, jobs one place, shopping one place. This is the exact opposite of the 15-minute city. Next slide, please. Bridgeport, so let's just quickly look at a different aspect of this. This is a graph done by a friend from Buffalo, Chuck Banus, and it shows the extent of the metropolitan area of Buffalo, New York in 1950. And in red is the new extent. So you see a place that is blowing up, going from that orange bit to the red bit. And you think, okay, well, maybe it was growing in terms of jobs, in terms of population. Let's look at what actually happened in Buffalo. Next slide, please. Keep clicking through. 1950, 1.1 million, 1.2 million in 2000. No population growth in the metropolitan area. The land area, click please, two more, 120 square miles compared to 365 square miles. This is the essence of unsustainable growth. And Buffalo is, again, not unique. Look at Rochester, look at Cleveland, look at almost any city in the Midwest and in the Northeast. The Northeast probably worse than anywhere else. We look at New Jersey, you look at Massachusetts, Connecticut, New York is horrible. So we have changed the nature of the city. We had the 15-minute city, and now we have something else that is not really serving us very well. Next slide, please. And another side of this, very quickly, this is another graph, so you're going to have to just click through to the bottom. Jim, please bring up the graph. Yes. One more and two more. So Buffalo going from almost 600,000 people to less than half of that. And this is not the worst case. Think about Detroit going from 2 million almost to 500,000 now. So keep going. So part of what we're talking about here with this 15-minute city is akin to the discussion that is going on in other sphere about biodiversity. We need urban places that are diverse, that are resilient. And that's how cities function. That's how cities thrive. And the 15-minute city, to me, is about creating that ecosystem, that human ecosystem where economic life, social life can flourish. Next slide. So as I said yesterday, I spent some time going on the internet and looking to see what being said. And I found this really great site, 15-minute city, and this article written about the 15-minute city. And one of the things it talks about, the next slide, please. And that's the blog. It talks about using Carlos Moreno is the gentleman in Paris that coined the term the 15-minute city. And he says that there are 4 key characteristics. Please go to the bullets, Jim. The first is proximity. The second is diversity. The third is density. And the fourth is ubiquity. And what he says, I mean, you look at this list and it's nothing different from what you have learned in school about planning. It's really about the fact that in transportation, access is what matters, not mobility. So we need things to be close to each other. We need to build cities where things are close to each other. That means we cannot continue to build cities, schools, massive schools at the edge of cities. That is not providing proximity. Diversity, land use mix provide the range of amenities that are needed. Density, because you want to make sure that there are enough people to support the diversity of businesses. And finally, you want to make sure that you have enough of these neighborhoods. So it's satisfying the needs of everybody. Unlike what we have now in America, where we have so few of these kinds of neighborhoods in places like San Francisco and Seattle and Cambridge. I don't know if you're seeing a pattern here, places where most people can't afford to live. So these are places that we need to have everywhere. Keep going. But one of the things that struck me about the article, and it might not have struck you, can you go to the next slide, Jim, is this picture. And this picture is a picture of my new hometown of Zurich, Switzerland. And the article does not mention Zurich, but it's clear to me that the author is given the message that Zurich is the model 50-minute city. And so it's validated my desire to talk about Zurich. It suggests that I am on the right track. So the next slide, please. So this is the poster child. Next slide. Zurich, Switzerland. And that's what I'm going to spend the rest of the time talking about, Zurich. So next slide, please. So Zurich, Switzerland, it's a city. Firstly, it's in what is called the Mittelland in Switzerland. It is where most of the 8 million people in Switzerland live, because a lot of the country, you're not going to live there. It's the Alps. So Zurich is a really powerful little city. It has nominally a metropolitan area of 2 million people. So all of these little towns that you see here, very compact, surrounded by lots of greens. And you can see in the northwest quadrant, it follows a river, the settlement pattern. You can see the airport to the north, and those are following transportation corridors, powerful transportation corridors. You can see over in the far northeast, that's the city of Winterthur, which is part of the metropolitan area. So you see a metropolitan area that is not sprawl, but it's made up of these networked, connected, highly connected cities and villages. And what is interesting is that in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, Zurich dodged a bullet because it was going down the same path that we were following. It was becoming sprawly and auto-dependent. And so I want to talk a little bit about that. Next slide. So that's Zurich with metropolitan area 2 million. I should point out, however, that even though the population of the metropolitan area is really hard to define, this is just really the state of Zurich and the surrounding states, but it doesn't include the Black Forest of Germany, the Lake Constance in Germany, which it's part of the catchment area. People actually come from those places an hour away to work in Zurich, which is not exactly a 50-minute city concept, But Zurich is so powerful that it provides so much job and so much draw from such a wide area. This is zooming in a little bit more. So let's go back to the last slide, Jim, and toggle back to the next one. So you can see at the end of the lake, that's the city of Zurich. And this now is showing just the city itself, which is about 0.4 million people. Again, 20 years ago, Zurich was about 0.3 million people. 0.4 million people now, 0.3 million people back then, because it had been steadily bleeding population to the suburbs until it decided to take its fate into its own hands. So the same thing that was happening to Buffalo or to Cleveland was happening in Zurich. The city is at the head of the lake, and in the city limits are these fairly sizable hills, one going up to 2,000 feet, that is within the city limits. That's part of the green for the citizens of Zurich. Next slide, please. And this is zooming even further. And what I consider to be the heart and soul of the city is the train station on the Limmat River, with the river seal running through the train station itself. Underground there, what you don't see is a massive complex of shopping. And this train station has 3,000 trains internationally and going to other parts of Switzerland. So this is a part of the story of the 15-minute city, is being connected not just within, but to the Alps, to surrounding cities, and internationally. And by the way, just in the center of your picture and to the left side is a new development that is being built by the train company, which I think is really magnificent. It's called Europa Alley. So if you look up that, you'll see pictures of Europa Alley. So let's keep going. So let me start again, the history. Let's start with the story of Zurich. Zurich really is created by the tram system that started in the 1880s. Before the tram system, we had these little villages. Zurich was just a tiny village on the lake and surrounded the Limmat River. With the coming of the trams, the surrounding villages decided that they would join. So in 1893, all the surrounding villages, the first outer ring suburbs, joined in, and they were all became part of this tram network. Next picture. And this was further enhanced in the 1890s with electric tram that could manage the hills. And so those suburbs further up the hills also joined in. And in 1934, there was even more addition to the city. Next picture. So this is a streetcar network from 1917. And why this is interesting is because a lot of you work in cities where you could put up a streetcar network like this. The difference is that in Zurich, the current streetcar network is twice the length of what you're seeing here. That's not the case in almost anywhere in America. Next slide, please. But Zurich suffered from lots of threats to it being a 15-minute city, and some of it scrambled too, but others it was able to fight off. One of them was to its own Swiss architect Le Corbusier, who was born in the Swiss canton of the Jura, and he had the idea that we needed to build a different type of city. Next slide. That's Mr. Corbusier, who was on the 20-franc notes in Switzerland. Next one. And this was his idea for Paris. This was never built. Next slide. But we know that all over America. In the 50s, we recreated our cities in that image. For example, Hartford, Connecticut, 1953. Next slide, please. Just 9 years later, I remember going to a conference in October of 2001, and these two pictures were shown to a room of planners at the I don't remember the name of the conference, but the audience gasped in horror when they showed the transformation. And again, this is something that happened in cities after city. Next slide, please. This was the version that was presented for the transformation of Zurich in 1933 by an architect called Karl Moser in the Ala Le Corbusier. I should point out, ironically, that I now live in a building that was designed by Karl Moser. But this is that view of what was suggested that Zurich become. The next slide. This is what it looks like now, still the same medieval city that it ever was in the downtown. So that was one bullet that it missed. Next one. But another one that it did not miss was transforming streets into places for motor vehicles rather than places for cars. This is the Langstrasse in Zurich. And you can see how it was used at the turn of the century. Next slide. And you might be familiar with this book by a very good friend, Peter Norton, that talks about the battle that went on for the life of cities, for the how streets were to be defined or designed. Next slide. And he talks about this need to get the pedestrians away from the street and to get them to behave. And this is actually in Zurich in the 1920s. Next slide. Is exactly the same attitude was pervaded. Traffic education for school kids. Next one. The definition of the street, forcing pedestrians to behave. So the exact same attitudes, they were not immune, and a lot of the streets were transformed into places where cars could go 30, 40 miles per hour. So these are some of the changes that happened in Zurich, it happened in Paris, and started to nibble away at the idea of the 15-minute city. Next slide, please. And another thing that happened, this is another graph slide, so if you just click through it. This shows in the after World War II, keep going. After World War II, the growth in motor vehicle use in the city of Zurich, actually the ownership of motor vehicle. Next, two more clicks. And what's interesting for me is that we are now somewhat shocked by the rate of automobile ownership in China. Just after the war, the rate of ownership of automobile growth in Zurich was larger than that in China, that we're seeing in China now. So you can imagine that this is a path that they were on, and they could have continued on that path. Next slide. And part of that was a Swiss federal government desire to build freeways. And what they desired was to build freeways meeting in the middle of the city. And I always am amused. This is one section of freeway that they were able to build. But what's amusing to me about this is that in America, we built the freeways on the river. That's bad enough. In Switzerland, they decided to build. That was a good idea to build the freeway in the river. Next slide. Next slide. And next one. All right. So the government in a lot of these countries, not just Switzerland, in the Netherlands, all over Europe, were hell bent on creating an auto-dependent society. These were sketches of a plan that was put forward by the federal government, by the city government, to transform the forecourt of the train station into parking for cars. Next slide. I'll keep going. This was a plan to put the trams underground into subway. They actually built, I think, 3 of these stations. Keep going. But the difference between Switzerland and here, here in America, citizen activists fought, in some cases won, but in most cases lost. In Switzerland, you are required to put a project like this to a vote. So in 1962, the voters rejected a highway plan. Next slide. And at the same time, they rejected this plan for putting the subway underground. Next slide. Same thing again in 1973. The government came back with the same kind of plan and it was rejected. And at this time, the city was decaying, the population was being lost, the streets were being made wider and wider, etc. Keep going. So keep going. We can just go through this very quickly. So 1993, no to the suburb, no to the highways. Keep going. So one of the interesting things that people are sometimes so surprised at is, why was this reaction? Why did they vote down putting the trains on the ground? And keep going. And the reasons given, there are 3 of them. 3 reasons, 3 clicks. They didn't want the Manhattanization. They didn't want an excessively dense city of Zurich. Second, they felt that a subway facilitated longer distance travel and disadvantaged short distance travel. This is really sophisticated thinking by people and citizen activists in saying that building a subway would allow people in the suburbs more advantage. It would advantage the suburbs and disadvantage the city. And the third reason is that they saw, and again, very sophisticated thinking by advocates and people that were not trained in planning, they saw this as a ploy by the government to free up road space for cars and to attract more cars to the center city. So they were able to convince the populace to reject this plan. Keep going. And then they realized, next slide. Then they realized, keep going. Next slide. They realized then that you couldn't keep just fighting against a plan. You needed to have a plan to fight a plan. So they came up with their own plan, and the plan had 6 points: give priority in law and policy to buses and trams, create exclusive bus lanes and traffic signal priority. 3, increase frequency of transit service. 4, expand the transit system. 5, improve the interchange between lines. And 6, improve the stop areas. And if you go to Zurich now, you'll see all of these 6 items are the points that guide the provision of transit in Zurich. So the people's plan won. And what is ironic is that the government complained that this would be too expensive, but this plan was much, much less expensive than the highway plan would have been. And I think you find the same here. We always getting pushback against transit because it's too expensive, but nobody pushbacks against highways and the cost of highways. Next slide. If you, this is another book that I recommend by Jarrett Walker. And if you read Jarrett Walker and you go to Zurich, this book actually came out while I was in Zurich the first time. And I was reading it, and I would read all the points that he pointed out, and I would go out and experience it on the streets of Zurich. Next slide, please. One of the points he makes is this idea that frequency is freedom. In Zurich, the transit lines, and this refers to transit of any type, small, big, medium, in the city, comes every 7 minutes, which is perfect for you to just, you don't need a schedule. You just go out there and you know something is going to come pretty soon. Next slide, please. And this is an example of the prioritization. This is actually an image showing on this street, half of the street is for transit and half are for cars. When the transit comes, the line of cars are forced to stop because the transit actually goes in both directions. Very interesting how they use the space to provide priority to the transit. Next slide. This is an example on the street I live. I actually live above that green patch. And this is a situation where the tram stop right is in the lane. So the cars have to stop when the tram stops. Next slide. Expanding transit. In the early 90s, they expanded a transit system that goes as far, I would say 30 miles in either direction from the city, in all directions from the city, going to the city of Zug, city of Schaffhausen, into other states. And so the whole network of little towns are networked by transit to Zurich. And what has happened is that over time, people realize that they're not welcome to drive their car into Zurich, so they take the transit. And they also recognize the success of Zurich. And what is happening now is that the suburbs, and this has been happening for the last 2 decades, the suburbs are trying to emulate Zurich. So in the early noughts, a set of Zurich suburbs north of Zurich built 2 lines of streetcars, one to the airport. And now currently, a set of suburbs to the west are building their own streetcar. So they're seeing how transit work, they're seeing how urbanism work, and these tiny, some of them tiny villages are wanting in on that good. The quality of life that you see in Zurich is something that they want in these suburbs also, and they're following along in the same direction. Next slide, please. Yeah, this is a video, Jim, so let it play. So this just to show you the magnitude of the transit system. You might see it, it's in the top middle, and that's a 14-car train, a double-decker train. And my friend, one of my best friends, live in a village which is about 8 miles out of Zurich, and 10 minutes by train. And her train stop is in a field looking just like that one. And you see this massive 14-car train stops in this village of 10,000 people. And hundreds of people are getting off this train. And it's just really kind of an amazing sight to see how transit is used in this context. Next slide. So we saw the run up in vehicles in Zurich after the war. Next slide. This is what has happened since, that the ownership of cars has leveled off at a very low level and is actually going down. what has happened is that in a lot of places in America, car is growing, we need bigger roads, we need wider roads. And so we have this vicious cycle of creating the atmosphere where you actually need a car. So car ownership increases. The exact opposite happened in Zurich. They took control of their fate. They said, this is what we want for a city. And we are going to build the transportation infrastructure that supports that type of a city. And you can see that it has worked in terms of things like how people use car in the city. Next slide. Okay, next one. Not sure what's going on. Okay, so one of the things, another click. Actually, and so one of the things that is really amazing about this is that we think of transit as being the expensive option. One of the reasons I was able to move to Zurich was that I can afford it because all of a sudden, moving to Zurich means that I do not need two cars in my household. And so my transportation cost annually will be 4,000K annually for access to everything in Zurich, to everything in the entire country, in all the cities in the country, and to all the intercity trains running in the entire country. Talk about access for cheap. The other part, another click, is that how can that be? This must be really, really expensive. In reality, most of the cost of running the system is from fare box return. Those of you that are familiar with this concept realize that a lot of the bus systems in America, we're talking about 20%. So government has to subsidize at a rate of 80%. That's not the case here. 60% from fare box return. And part of that is that transit of this type are really long lasting. If you can see that red tram, that's a 40-year-old tram. Next to the tram with the blue number 4, that one was just released this year. So they're upgrading the trams this year after 20 years. And I thought it was a really great picture showing the old and the new side by side. And part of the explanation as to, it's really about long-term thinking, about long-term ways of dealing with transportation and land use. So next slide, please. So years ago, I found this map on the transportation plan of Zurich. And what it's showing is what their mapping of what the neighborhood centers in the city look like. And they describe neighborhood centers as places where you have access to pharmacies, to groceries, to schools, etc. And these were the in 1998. The next slide. And this is what they were planning. So an even denser network of neighborhoods. And I've seen this come about over time in Zurich. And interestingly, in the short time I've been there, I've seen this change where this densification of neighborhood has occurred. I don't completely understand all of the mechanism that goes into doing this. This semester, I'm working with a student at the ETH, 2 students, PhD student and an undergrad student, to try to better understand for me what is the mechanism, the whole panoply of policies that are used to do this. Next slide, please. But I can talk very quickly about this particular project, which I saw come up out of the ground. This site used to be a depot, a surface depot for the trams. The trams would go every night to sleep there. So it's government-owned land. the government decided that this was a waste of land in the center of the city, and they decided to build housing. They decided to develop it. And what they did was they contracted with what in Switzerland is known as a Genossenschaft. It's a housing co-op. And a housing co-op came up with this plan for housing on the top and businesses on the bottom, including this theater, a theater bar, restaurants, a grocery store, a bookstore, lots of little cafes. Next slide. A city park. This is the entrance, actually. It's a little bit daunting to get to the park, but the park is up there. So all of this is part of this vision of what you put on a property of land, just one block. Next slide. And this is what that park looks like. I remember being there last March with a friend, and there was a slide, and we were using the slide, and he was shocked when he came out to the slide to find that there were these rows of infants in cribs and no adults in sight. This was at a kindergarten on the property. So this idea of cooperative housing in a very rich city means that a lot of the housing, 25% of housing in Zurich, is from these cooperatives. And so you have affordable housing for a lot of people in the city. Next slide. By the way, they maintained this site as a depot. So you can see the trains coming at night to sleep, and you get a beautiful view. If you're a transit person, you get a beautiful view from the restaurant or from the movie theater. I'm sure it's, any of you that are transit folks, it's worth the trip. So next slide, please. So there are so many other directions I could go, but I think I will leave it there, and I will entertain any questions that you might have that I can answer. So thank you very much for your attention, and thank you for the invitation to speak with you.
Wonderful, thank you. We do have some questions. Folks, type those questions in to the chat box, and we'll see how many of these we can get to in a couple minutes here. I'm just going to turn my webcam back on so I can. There, hi. Okay, so can you speak to ubiquity? Is there tension between ubiquitous neighborhoods to be affordable that are also able to maintain unique neighborhood flavors, such as culture, history, architecture?
That is one of the things that I'm slowly learning about Zurich, is that the idea of the 50-minute city. So yes, in my neighborhood, I have 4 grocery stores at different price levels. But sometimes I want something special. Maybe I want some callaloo, is a Jamaican vegetable that I can get in Calbright. So I have to go across town. So what has happened is that all of these different neighborhoods have different flavors and different things going on. So they're self-reinforcing, and the fact that they're networked by the transit really helps to do that.
Thank you. Okay, so aside from New York City, are any cities on the right track to becoming 15-minute cities?
I think Seattle has done a really great job. Part of it is the transit, but also part of it is the TOD programs. So yes, there's a lot of good that is going on in Seattle. Washington, D.C. to a lesser extent. I think Washington really needs to work on their streetscape, but I think Washington has done a pretty good job also. There are quite a few. I think what is good now is that compared to 20 years ago, there are lots of examples. Unfortunately, still, the examples in America are still very, very pricey because there's so few of those places. But places like Buffalo and Rochester, it's 2 cities that I know very well that have beautiful old neighborhoods that were not destroyed. Those places have such potential. Cleveland also, they have such potential to develop places like Ohio City in Cleveland, Elmwood Village in Buffalo, the East Side in Rochester. So Detroit, the potential to recreate those patterns in Detroit is just amazing. Chicago also.
Great, thank you. How is land use regulated in Zurich? Is there zoning as we know it here in the US? How does that work?
So I do not have a full answer to that question. Yes, there is zoning. Yes, there are things like you see all those hillsides that are not developed. I recognize that that is probably due to zoning. So there's a hard edge to the city. So for example, I can walk 10 minutes to the forest and there are miles and miles of forest. So the top of the mountains are not developed. The zoning, I don't know what it looks like. It's not really. My German is still coming around, I should say, but I don't really know the full story. I can say things like it's clear that they do not have single-use zoning, for example. Because in my neighborhood, which is, we have villas, we have a lot of what I would call mixed, the missing middle, as that term is used here. But you have villas, you have missing middle. You don't have a lot of single family houses, but you also have lots of commercial opportunities within the neighborhood, including, surprisingly, a service garage right in the middle of my neighborhood. And you have a lot of these Ganosian shafts, these housing co-ops that are sprinkled all over the city. So there is, the zoning clearly allows for that kind of diversity.
Okay, thank you. This next question is going to kind of tee up another question. So can you explain a little more about whether or not a successful 15-minute city has to have densities like Manhattan level density in order for it to work?
Definitely not. Zurich is not at that, and you can see one of the objections they had to put in the trains on the ground was they didn't want to be like Manhattan or Munich or Frankfurt. The density in Zurich is at most 4 stories. In most places, that the highest the density gets to. The difference is that we don't have many zones of single family housing, just on the very edge of the city. So most housing is multifamily. And I remember giving an example in class while I was teaching at ETH. It had pictures of single family. And the students pointed out to me that this is not very sustainable. And coming from the American perspective, I'd never thought of it from that perspective. But there is more and more discussion that we somehow need to move to be less dependent on this single family housing. And how that works in Zurich and why it works so well, I think, is because of the networks of park. Some days I'm just walking down the street and I accidentally run into a park. And there are parks that might be one bench. The church yards are all parks. And the one next to me has this magnificent view of the Alps and the whole city. So everywhere in the city there are parks. So you don't feel the density. But it's not Manhattan density at all. It's less than San Francisco density also.
Do you see yourself ever living in Zurich full time?
That's the plan. This is why I'm retired. The pandemic has an obstacle. That's one of the reasons why we are not there full time right now.
Okay, let's see. Next question. You know what? Let's go a little bit further for a minute into this idea about density and how to achieve a 15-minute city. We talked when we did our training a little bit about how a lot of our planners are coming from big urban centers, regardless if you have a lot of density or a lot of multifamily housing, whatever it might be. So how can folks here on the line take some of the concepts of a 15-minute city, like what makes it so attractive and sustainable, and implement it in their communities that maybe, don't have the density, don't have the multifamily housing? How can they take some of these principles and inject them into their communities?
Well, I think the idea of a 50-minute city has nothing to do with the size of the community. It does have something to do with the density, because if it is about all single family housing, then that's very difficult. But most places, certainly in Connecticut, there are places where you need higher density, where you could have the mixed use, etc. That would be supported by the residential districts that are single family. So it's probably looking at different areas of the city in different ways and seeing where you can add density. But in America, as we know, density is often a bad word, because it's been so beaten into us. And I've always thought that this was a neutral issue, but I'm now reading The Color of Law, where they talk about some of the racially charged ways that this idea of single family housing was sold in America. But all towns need affordable housing. All towns need a variety of different housing. Our town, the town I live in, is a university town. We need more affordable and multifamily housing. What happens here is that the single family housing get converted to housing for students. And it really is in some ways wrecking the the quality of life here, because if we leave those needs to providing them in ways that are not responsible, we need to find responsible ways of dealing with younger people, single people, etc. All people do not want or need single family housing.
So how do we convince then our decision makers, our mayors, our councils, our regional reps, whoever they are, how do we convince them that, public transportation is great? How do we convince them that affordable housing is necessary, that multifamily housing is efficient and affordable and necessary? Where do we begin?
I think it's hard, but we have begun, and we are doing it in places that never would have thought of doing it. Minneapolis changed its zoning. Hartford is thinking about it. I think the big point to convince people is to talk about, when people think about density, for example, they have a specific vision in their mind that is really negative. In reality, density is not necessarily like that. So we can convince people by having examples to point to. And this is what I'm trying to do with this talk, is give one example of a place where the quality of life is exceedingly high, but it's in the context of that kind of environment where people live in apartment houses, where people use transit. The transit use is just out of this world in that city. I mean, you don't think about driving in Zurich. So it's really having examples, is making a case, but we're going to have to keep making them over and over. I see progress being made 10 years ago, 20 years ago. And this is why I said that Paris is so important, because it's a huge city that is trying to turn around this big tanker to go in a different direction. But Paris is important, Chicago is important. If we can get a city like Detroit online, and it's happening, I think that's going to be a really powerful example for a lot of places.
Let's jump back to Zurich and the example that you had given. And this question says, it's interesting that citizens of Zurich rejected the subway in favor of trams and buses. can you talk a little bit about how Zurich is handling the bicycle network along with that?
So 10 years ago, there was hardly any biking in Zurich. I was shocked, but at the time, I have some friends work for the city, and they were pushing developing biking, and they've succeeded. It went from about 2% bike share to I think about 10% now. And they've been the neighborhood that I showed with that new building. That neighborhood is on the flat side of town, and at night you see more bikes on the street there than you see cars. So that's how it has been transformed. The problem with Zurich is that trams are preeminent, and trams sometimes don't play well with bikes because bikes get stuck in the tracks and things like that. And of course, the transit networks takes a lot of space that that you could use for biking. So trying to compromise between those two is a problem. One of the things that has really transformed Zurich is electric bikes. So my neighborhood on the side of a hill that's that steep, all of a sudden you're seeing people zipping up those hills, and it's transformed that part of the city. It's not Amsterdam though. I don't think it will ever be.
Thank you. Okay, next question. This is a good one. A lot of the developments in the US rely on private developers who use private financing to build projects, right? So the mix of uses is dictated essentially by what can be financed. So
Yes.
how are projects financed in Zurich?
Ah, boy. So those are some of the things that I do not have good answers for. I'm aware of one particular piece of land. It's a brownfield. It used to be owned by the bank, and I think it reverted to the city. So that's part of what makes things work, is that a lot of these land where you can develop on is these old industrial land that the city has some say in. And I think what helps is that there's this tradition of funding the cooperative housing. So this goes back to the 1920s. So there is a mechanism in place where people understand the system by which this work, and also how they work with commercial things. So most of these Genossenschaft also have a Stiftung, which is also the commercial equivalent of the cooperative. So there is a culture that supports that. So, and then you have a bank, a state bank, the Zurich Cantonal Bank, which is a commercial bank, but it really operates like it's more like a social enterprise rather than just strictly a commercial enterprise. So that also helps to get things like this done.
Okay, it's time to wrap up. And there are still quite a few questions. There are some really interesting questions that we didn't get a chance to get to. But Norman, it was really nice talking to you. This was a really a great session, and you're very knowledgeable. And congrats on retiring, and just have some fun, folks. This session has been recorded. We'll post it up on our YouTube channel. We'll also have a PDF copy of this slide deck available on our website. So don't forget to head over there also to register for our upcoming sessions, ohioplanning.org/planning webcast. And don't forget to log those CM credits. Thanks to the Urban Design and Preservation Division for sponsoring today's session. And thanks to you, Norman, for speaking with us today. We appreciate it. Oh, Jim, thank you for housing the slides today. In a pinch, we appreciate it.
Thanks,
everyone.
That was a difficult set of slides.
It worked. technology.
Okay.
All right, guys. Well, thanks so much for joining us. Everyone, have a great weekend. Stay safe. Take care. We'll talk next time.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Thank you.